I guess I started preaching about 60 years ago when I was 4. Well, that's what my parents tell me anyway. I mean, I barely remember, I would, entertain my folks' guests and relatives by standing behind the end table in our living room, using it for my pulpit. Now, at that point, my only model for a preacher was my home church preacher, who was a very conservative, tell it like it is, prophet type. And so I mostly told our guests that they were going to hell. They were going to hell for some horrendous sin that they had committed, like smoking, I was 16 years old when I received what I feel was a very personal call from the Lord to the preaching ministry. I preached throughout high school and Bible college days. And after that, I was a designated preacher for the 4 years that I sang full-time with the Gospel Lads out of Joplin, Missouri, and then went back to the West Coast, where I served a congregation in San Jose for 11 years as their preacher, then 21 years in Eugene, Oregon, in a preaching ministry, and I've now been preaching here at CCY for 8 years. And I still often think to myself, I can't believe that straight now for 40 years, these past 40 years, I'm being paid for something that I absolutely love to do. Well, most of the time. I say that because every minister, and oh, by the way, this is not a sermon for preachers. This is a sermon for ministers. Every single Christian that is here today has received a ministry. You are a minister. Every minister has their times when they say, well, I think I love to do this. There are times of doubt and discouragement and second guessing and maybe even questioning their calling. Today's message is for every Christian that has identified a ministry, whether you've been working for the Lord just a few days or for decades. This message is for you. Because every ministry, every minister is subject to mood swings. We're going to look at having a healthy ministry despite those mood swings, okay? Your ministry can survive your moods. We began the Acts series again. We go for a while and then stop and go for a while, and we're actually kind of in the third phase. We began this series a couple weeks ago with Acts 16. Paul had begun his second missionary journey there in Acts 16, and he and Silas, later joined by Timothy and Luke, they had left Antioch of Syria. That was the home church, and they traveled and they went through Lower Asia, which we would call modern-day Turkey, and they were just revisiting some of the new churches that they had established in various towns on the first journey. Now this is their second journey, and after they'd been through those familiar towns, because of a very specific call that Paul received from the Lord, they crossed the Aegean Sea and entered into new territory. He thought he was going to go up further into Asia. God said, no, I want you to go west, young man. Go west. And they went into the area of Europe, where the gospel had never been taken before. And there they began, and that's still in Acts 16, to establish some of those churches. Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea. That's where we were at last week in Acts 17. And then Paul took off by himself for a little journey. He went to Athens. He went there alone. And Athens at the time was a city that was devoted to worshiping the Greek gods. And Paul went into that environment, very pagan, and he preached the gospel there. And this included going to a place that we still are aware of if we go visit Greece, the Areopagus, where he laid out before the people that were there a case for Christ, before this crowd of pagan philosophers. And when it was pretty much all done at the end of Acts 17, here's what Luke says. Luke's always giving a little, here's how it went, kind of a report. And so often he'll say, and thousands came to the Lord and many believed. But at the end of Acts 17, at the end of Athens, he says, and a few believed. And that takes us to where we are today, Acts 18. After this, after not so great of a response to the gospel, Paul left Athens and he went to Corinth. And we've heard of Corinth. We read the book Corinthians, the two letters written to the church that was established there. But at this point, there's no church there, okay? He just went to Corinth, and there he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. Well, we've heard of them, Aquila and Priscilla, because Claudius, that would have been the emperor of the day, had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. That's why Aquila and Priscilla were in Corinth. They had fled Rome. Paul went to see them, verse 3. And because he was a tent maker, as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. Verse 5. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, you remember? Paul had been by himself there for a little while. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. But when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." And then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord. And many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. Do you feel the flow of this? You see, your ministry can survive your moods. I'm going to do a little bit of guesswork, educated guesswork with this text. I'm going to guess Paul's moods, that they're swinging from lower to higher as we work through these 8 verses. The old spiritual says, sometimes I'm up, sometimes I'm down. And I think when Paul left Athens, he was singing the first verse. The second verse. He was singing, sometimes I'm down. Or maybe his song was, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. He says, this is why I say this is somewhat of an educated guesswork. He says when he writes 1 Corinthians, in the 2nd chapter of 1 Corinthians, in the 3rd verse, he says, when I first came to you, and that's what we're reading about right here, when he first came to them, he said, I came to you in weakness and in fear and in trembling. I think Paul was down. Now, this situation, I know I'm doing a little guesswork here, but I think Athens to him had been a disaster. At least in comparison with the efforts of previous cities where, as I already mentioned, Luke said large numbers and many came, but in Athens, a few. Now, they're interesting. The Bible doesn't record that he ever returns to Athens, that he ever goes back, that there's even a church there. And so he comes to Corinth and he's discouraged and he's dejected and he's deflated. It's about a 40-mile trip from Athens to Corinth. Sound familiar? Sometimes I'm down. Has your ministry taken some hits lately? Does success seem to be waning? I didn't say raining because there's been a lot of that this last week. Is success waning? Have you looked at the stats inside your bulletin? Our present average worship attendance is 20 less than where we were last year at this point. Our giving is 1,000 less per week. I'm giving you weekly average. It is 1,000 less than last year's at the same time. I got to tell you, it bothers me. I got to tell you, it affects my moods. Now, I know all the reasons. Don't come give me all the reasons when I'm through here today, that numbers alone should never be the only measure of ministry. I know that. I'm just saying, I still keep track, and it still bothers me sometimes. It still can affect my moods. These things can do that, can't they? It can do that to an entire congregation where it affects our moods. Now here's the trick. The trick is to not let it have a detrimental effect on your ministry. Your ministry can survive your moods because God gave it to you and He gifted you. And He expects that to be used on a regular, daily basis as you move through life. As I move through life. So, I think we can find some pieces of advice here, okay? Whether you're up or down. Let's take the down first. When you're down, dig in. When you're down, dig in. Do you see it there? Verse 2. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. Because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome, Paul went to see them. Paul made the effort. He made some friends immediately after he got there with fellow Jewish believers. He met a Jew named Aquila. He went to see them. When he walked into Corinth and looked around, he saw the political commercial center of Greece. He saw a Roman colony that was full of Greek paganism, just like the city he had left, just like Athens. He saw the temple to the Greek goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of love, where people could go and spend their money to buy pleasure with one of the temple prostitutes and then call it worship. I mean, the word Corinthian came to be used as an adjective in that day to describe gross sexual immorality. So when Paul walks into Corinth, he feels like a stranger in a foreign land, like a fish out of water. He probably felt like holding the fort, isolating, but somehow, do you see? He recognized his need to find other Christians. When you're down, don't retreat from Christian friendship and from Christian fellowship. In fact, seek it out. Seek fellowship. When you're down, dig in. Good piece of advice there. Seek fellowship. Here's another piece. Keep busy. Verse 3. And because he was a tent maker, as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Now, Paul might have been out of money. I mean, there's no church there. Not yet. There's no church to give him support. And if he was going to receive support from some of those other churches, he would have to wait until Silas and Timothy brought it, because they weren't there yet. And I think even though we often think of Paul as kind of a white-collar guy, he's not afraid to work with his hands. Every Jewish boy had to learn a trade. And Paul's was tent making. And so he seeks out this friendship, this fellowship, and then he gets busy setting up shop with Aquila and Priscilla. When you're down, don't become idle. Don't just sit around. It's a strong temptation, isn't it? Because motivation doesn't seem to be there. Motivation is at a standstill. Resist that urge. Keep busy with whatever your abilities are. Stay productive. Here's a third piece of advice. Maintain the basics. Look at verse 4. Every Sabbath, he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade the Jews and the Greeks. Now, if you know Paul and you know his ministry, if you can remember the first 16 chapters that we've been through in Acts, you know that's his pattern. He always did it that way. He always would go to the synagogue first and share with the Jewish people the gospel. He might have felt weak and trembling at this point. He did, we know that. But he still chipped away at his mission, sharing the gospel. Every Sabbath. I love that. Okay, go ahead and make your tents for 5 or 6 days. But every Sabbath, you get back to the basics. And he went down to the synagogue. You know, whether I feel like it or not, I still study for the sermons. I still say, I got to write something down here. I still ask God's help. I try to maintain the basics. You know, another basic of pastoral ministry, as all of you probably would, if you made a list, you'd say this, would be just calling on people that are sick, that are in the hospital. And I still remember, it's been what? How long has it been since 1994? It's been 18 and 6 years. It's been 24 years. I still remember that year, and I still remember the first half of that year when I was really struggling deep with depression. And then I remember that month when the shepherds, the elders of the church said to me, you need to take this month off. You're making us all depressed. No, they didn't say that. But they said, you need to take this month off and work through this. And so I did, but I knew better than to just stay home and do nothing. And so I still remember one day I said, well, I got to do something. I've got to schedule something. I can't just hang out here at the house. I know, I'll go see June Chase. Now, June Chase was a 80-something, frail. She had taken so many steroids. You know that issue with steroids. They help, but they don't. But she had to in order to breathe, but it was taking its toll on the rest of her. And she was in the hospital and barely able to breathe and barely able to speak. And I went and saw June. And I still remember walking away saying, how in the world did she end up making me feel better? Just maintain the basics. Just maintain the basics. What are your minimum requirements of ministry in your life, who you are? You know, OU played UCLA yesterday, and there's a story about a UCLA football coach a few years back named Pepper Rogers, and life was miserable for him during a season when his Bruins got off to a horrible start, kind of like yesterday, and nobody would hang out with Coach Rogers. He said, my dog was my only true friend. He said, I told my wife that every man needs at least 2 good friends, and so she went out and bought me another dog. He said the players were having difficulty adapting to the wishbone offense that he had installed, and the school's alumni demanded that you adopt a different system, and Rogers didn't budge. He said the wishbone is like Christianity. Whew. He said, if you believe in it only until something goes wrong, you didn't believe it in the first place. That's great. In other words, he was saying, I am going to maintain the basics. I'm going to stick with it. Your ministry can survive your moods. When you're down, dig in. How? Just like Paul. Seek fellowship, keep busy, maintain the basics. And then you begin to see a change of mood. Verse 5. We're going to see things shift now to an upward. And when you're up, move out. When you're down, dig in. But when you're up, move out. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, I think that's the transitional. That's the hinge there in verse 5. Paul was in somewhat of a holding pattern up to this point, but when his buddies, Silas and Timothy, show up, his mood begins to change quickly. And I think he's definitely on the upswing in the last half of our text. It's always nice, isn't it, to feel good? I mean, ministry just flows a lot easier. Everything flows more easily. But we have to be careful. We have to be careful that we make sure all that positive energy is God-directed and not self-directed. We don't want our upward mood swing to turn into some kind of mania so that we're no longer living in reality. So what's some good advice that goes up with when you're up? When you're up, move out in what ways? Well, how about this? Recommit to the mission. Look at verse 5. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively, see, before that he's tent making, exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. Now, Perhaps there's a practical reason, that Silas and Timothy brought funds for his support, and Paul could return to evangelism full-time. But I think that they also brought such encouragement to Paul to get back to his calling. Paul, you can't sit around all week just making tents. That's not why we left on this journey. And note something else in verse 5. In verse 5, he's not reasoning and persuading as he was in Athens and as he was in verse 4 in the synagogue. In verse 5, he's preaching and testifying. Let her rip. There's a restorative ministry here. There's a second wind. Never underestimate what your encouragement might do for another brother or sister who's struggling with their own ministry. Never underestimate what your encouragement can do for the overall good of the kingdom. In this case, he recommits to the mission. How about, secondly, respond to criticism? But when the Jews opposed Paul, that's what verse 6 says. I mean, he's recommitted in verse 5. He's going to go out there and let the Jews have it, right? And he gets it right back from them. Here we go again. He's receiving abuse. But when the Jews opposed Paul and became abusive, he said, "Oh, no, not again." Is that what it says? And he retreated to the home of Priscilla and Aquila and went back to tent making. Now that's what the weakened Paul might have done. But what does the verse say? It says, but when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he just shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Boy, that's strength. Do you hear the strength there in Paul? He refuses to be intimidated. He even refuses to be made to feel guilty about this. He says, I'm clear of any responsibility. I'm not going to go walking away with my tail between my legs and feeling guilty. This time, they're not going to get to his mood. So there's a recommitment to his mission, and he's able to respond to criticism. And how about this? Redirect your efforts. Look at verse 7. Then Paul left the synagogue. That's where he had been going to the synagogue regularly, going to the Jews. He left the synagogue, and he went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. That's a pretty bold move. Well, I'll just go next door. There are times when we need to say, I've done all I can do. The rest is up to God. I'm going next door. Jesus encouraged us, didn't he, to go where the fields are ripe unto harvest, and he admonished us, don't throw your pearls before swine. And if your listeners, or those who are on the receiving end of your ministry, have just become argumentative and abusive, you may need to recognize the futility of just trying to run a plow through rock-hard soil and redirect your efforts to more receptive. Look at verse 8. Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord. And many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. Who's that first guy there? The guy in the synagogue. When did it happen? When he left the synagogue. Paul leaves the synagogue. He said, no more of this. And Crispus, the synagogue ruler, gets converted. It's kind of like a tough love evangelism here. And now those hard-hearted folks that were gathering next door in the synagogue could hear their own leader, whether he was with them or maybe even next door, praising God in song, lifting it to Jesus the Savior. Wow. Redirect your efforts. And what success? Many of the Corinthians, doesn't say a few believed, does it? It says many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. Wow. I just see the great upswing here from a guy who's down and has to just dig in to a guy who's up and is ready to move out. Dance like no one's watching. I don't know who wrote this. The author, I guess, is unknown. Dance like no one's watching. We convince ourselves that life will be better after after we get married, after we have a baby, after the kids are older, and then when the kids are older, we're frustrated that we've got teenagers to deal with. You know, we tell ourselves that life will be complete when our spouse finally gets their act together, when we get a nicer car, when we're able to go on vacation, when we can finally retire. Alfred Sousa wrote this: "For a long time it had seemed to me that life was about to begin. But there was always some obstacle in the way. Something to be gotten through first, some unfinished business, time still to be served, a debt to be paid. Then life would begin." He said, "At last it dawned on me that these obstacles were my life. That there is no way to happiness," he said, "but that happiness is the way. So stop waiting until you finish school, lose 10 pounds, start work, retire, get married, get divorced. Stop waiting until you get a new car, a new home, or until your old car is paid off, until your mortgage is gone, until you're off welfare, until the 1st of the 15th, until you've had a drink, until you've sobered up. There's no better time," he says, the writer of this particular piece, "there's no better time than right now to be happy. Because happiness is a journey, not a destination." Now that's pretty good advice, but I want to apply this to what we're talking about today. Slightly different application. He said happiness is a journey, not a destination. I say it this way: ministry is a journey, not a destination. The Lord wants ministry to be constantly flowing through His gifted people, regardless of our moods. Let's stand together. Your ministry can survive your moods. According to the boundless resources that are ours, where? Where are they? In Christ Jesus. That's what Paul said. That's where all those resources are, including strength for the day to move through those moods that so often beset us. Let's apply that to our lives and to the Lord as we sing together. Carrie's going to lead us. You may want this morning to make that all-important decision for Christ, like we were reading about here, people that believed, that were baptized, came into Christ and into the church. Maybe that's a decision you need to make, and we always offer that. And maybe there's a prayer need, and maybe it's something quiet and confidential, and you want to take it to the back. There's always people there, always a couple there waiting to pray with you and share in that special need, whatever it might be. You just make your way to the back and the prayer time will take place quietly. Or maybe you want to come to the front and pray with brothers and sisters and friends, want to do it that way, that's fine. Let's let this happen together, this time of ministry.